At a bank window in March 1933, a teller counted out a few bills as if each one were leaving the country. The customer held a passbook with both hands. Behind him, a line waited quietly, not because anyone felt safe, but because the alternative was worse. A bank could look solid from the street and still be unable to meet the people who had trusted it. That is the contradiction of this episode. Roosevelt rebuilt confidence by first admitting confidence was gone. The banking system had to close before Americans could be persuaded that reopening meant anything at all. On February 18, Roosevelt sat at a press dinner in New York while Hoover's warning moved toward him under the table. The room was bright with jokes, skits, applause, and political theater. The envelope was not. Hoover told the president-elect that hoarding had risen, banks were weakening, gold was leaving, and public alarm had reached a dangerous height. Roosevelt kept smiling. To Hoover, that looked reckless. To Roosevelt, it was strategy. Anything he said before taking office could make him co-owner of Hoover's failure. Roosevelt first wanted Carter Glass at Treasury. Glass had credibility with bankers, Democrats, and reformers. He also had fragile health, a suspicion of Roosevelt's flexibility, and one large unfinished purpose, separating commercial banking from securities selling. He wanted sound money. Roosevelt wanted room to move. Glass asked for assurances against inflation and asked whether a Morgan man could serve beneath him. Roosevelt Circle heard the Morgan address before they heard the policy argument. Glass declined. The old bridge between Wall Street and reform would not be the new Treasury. 3 days later, Charles Mitchell climbed the steps to room 301 of the Senate office building. He arrived with lawyers, documents, and the confidence of a man who had spent years being called indispensable. Across from him sat Ferdinand Pecora, a prosecutor who did not owe Wall Street anything. Outside the hearing, states were improvising emergency bank rules. Inside, National City's president tried to make every answer dry enough to die in the record. Pecora understood the opposite: the public did not need a lecture on finance. It needed to see how privilege behaved under oath. The first crack was not a dramatic confession. It was compensation. Pecora asked about National City's management fund, the bonus pool that made senior bankers rich during the boom. Mitchell explained it as professional incentive, almost as if ordinary Americans would recognize themselves in the problem of a $25,000 salary needing improvement. Then the committee moved to the payments made before the crash, the advances that were not reported as income, and the tax consequences that followed. A system built to sell confidence to the public had built special exits for the people at the top. Mitchell could defend almost anything until the words tax purposes entered the room. He had sold a block of National City stock after the crash, he said, to recognize a loss. The buyer was not named at first. The committee pressed. The sale had helped erase his taxable income for 1929, even as customers who bought the bank securities carried their losses in public. The legal line was not yet clear. The moral line was. Pecora had found a simple image, a bank president who had asked the country to trust him while arranging his own protection at home. By the second day, the hearing room had changed. Reporters crowded Mitchell for the name of the relative in the stock sale. Spectators lined the hall. Pecora went after loans made to executives so they could hold bank stock, and after lower-level employees who were not treated with the same mercy. The mechanics mattered: a security affiliate selling bank shares, loans to brokerages, private support for the bank's own stock. But the deeper mechanism was simpler. The bank had sold safety as a product while treating its own insiders as a different class of customer. On Sunday night, after an emergency board meeting, Mitchell resigned from National City. He called it a cloud of public misunderstanding. The public heard something else. Newspapers had turned his testimony into a national morality play, and even people who disliked Wall Street spectacle could see how useful the spectacle had become. Glass stayed publicly distant from Pecora, but privately he fed questions into the investigation. His reform bill needed proof. Pecora gave him proof with witnesses, documents, and sentences short enough for the country to repeat. On March 3, the day before inauguration, Hoover invited the Roosevelts to tea at the White House and made one last plea. The stock exchange had stopped trading. Hoover's own press secretary had pulled money from his account. Fed and Treasury officials wanted a national bank holiday, but Hoover could not bear to leave office by closing every bank in America. He asked Roosevelt to use emergency authority. Roosevelt told him to do it himself. When the last call ended, almost everyone was out of ideas. Then Glass asked what Roosevelt would do once the oath was his. Roosevelt said he was planning to close them. By the time Roosevelt spoke on March 4, state bank holidays were spreading so fast the national system was already half closed. His inaugural address turned banker misconduct into the justification for federal command. The money changers had fled, he said, and Washington would restore the temple. It was a moral argument for administrative power. The next day, Roosevelt did what Hoover had refused to do. He declared a national bank holiday. For the first time, the whole American banking system stopped at once. The strange part was the relief. People improvised with scrip, credit, barter, and patience because the closure finally matched what they already knew. Pretending the doors were normal had become the danger. At that moment, emergency became permission. Closing the banks was simple compared with reopening them. Roosevelt promised that only sound banks would return, but sound was not a clean category in a depression. Regulators sorted institutions into those that could stand, those that needed reorganization, and those that had to be liquidated. There were too many banks and too little time. So the policy carried a necessary fiction. The government could not inspect every balance sheet perfectly, but it could create a ritual of inspection strong enough to make depositors pause. Roosevelt's radio address supplied the other half of the ritual. He did not tell listeners that every bank was safe. He told them the weak ones would not simply be waved through, and that money in a reopened bank was safer than money hidden at home. When banks began reopening on March 13, New York returned first. The stock exchange reopened after 7 silent trading days and surged. Wall Street had been humiliated, but it was alive. The bank holiday did not end the fight over what banking would become. National City separated from its securities affiliate. Then Winthrop Aldrich of Chase went further, calling for a broader separation that would reach private firms and weaken Morgan's old model of influence. Glass was stunned. He wanted reform, but not necessarily a war on every powerful bank. Huey Long attacked him from another direction, defending small banks and warning that branch banking would let New York run the country. The crisis had changed the incentives. Bankers no longer agreed that all regulation was bad. They began maneuvering to shape regulation before it shaped them. This was the new game. Reform was not only a moral crusade after failure. It was also a contest over who would survive the cure, who would lose a business line, and who would inherit the trust that weaker institutions had spent. On March 21, a federal marshal knocked on Charles Mitchell's Fifth Avenue door with an arrest warrant. The charge was tax evasion. Roosevelt had approved the arrest. Mitchell pleaded not guilty, hired a formidable lawyer, and returned uptown through dark streets, but the old immunity had been broken. 2 days later, Thomas Lamont went to Washington hoping to calm Roosevelt. He offered cooperation, asked for time, and warned against breaking the market. Roosevelt wanted affiliates cut off, bonuses ended, and insiders forced into the light. The bank panic forced the doors closed. Pecora and Roosevelt made sure that when they reopened, Wall Street would not walk back through them as the same old authority. Next, the trial would become the reform.